Hey everybody, this is Maha,
And this is Dylan.
and we're the host of See, That Wasn't Too Hard, a podcast that explores everything from the human condition all the way down to process improvement. Isn't that right, Dylan?
Heck yes.
Dylan, would you like to introduce us to our new guest today?
Yeah, so joining us today is Brandon Cunningham, who is a licensed counselor and mental health professional, and also is familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous. I've asked him here today to speak to that last part because, as we've discussed on the show previously, I think there's a lot of potential value in those tools in helping continuously improve the habits that we want to make in our own lives, even if they're not addiction or alcohol related. And I want to just bounce those ideas off Brandon and get his insights, because he knows what he's talking about and I only pretend to be so.
Well, then let's get started. And we're going to start off with you, Brandon. I know that we kind of stole your introduction, but is there anything that we might have missed?
No, it's good to be on. Dylan is a good friend and was polite. I'll self-identify. I'm an alcoholic and an addict in recovery. I've been for about 7 years, and got into mental health a little bit before my recovery, actually, which is a little scary, but luckily not too long before I got help myself. But yeah, I love talking about my recovery. I love talking about AA, the 12 steps. There's 12 steps like everyone knows and has seen on TV, but there's 12 traditions as well. And one of those traditions is that none of us ever speak for AA as an institution, right? We just share our own experience, strength, and hope, and try to minimize the war stories. But yeah, so I'm happy to speak about 12 steps and in light of my own experience, but in no way, shape, or form do I represent AA or NA.
Yep, much respected. And we realize that, and our readers or listeners are going to realize that as well.
Thanks. So Brandon, I was thinking it might make sense to come up with like a standard failure mode, and like talk through how AA's steps or traditions might apply to helping you achieve growth in that. Well, as a counselor, how would you go about recommending someone most effectively make those changes in their life and their perspective?
It's a big question. It's a good question. I've definitely experienced that myself. And between my work and my own recovery, I think identifying weak boundaries, where boundaries don't exist but should exist, and maybe some boundaries that we've set kind of on somebody else's side of the road, right? Like we're trying to limit the way that other people perform. That might be something like micromanaging, right? But dealing with personalities that conflict with ours is that's life as a human, right? We're going to clash. So I think for me, one important process has been gaining insight into my own emotions, emotional responses, better understanding what, because a lot of times I think there's a conflict between what our values are, right? What our ideals are and what our reality is when the rubber hits the road, right? And I think a lot of us just kind of cloister up and go into, as you said, kind of failure mode, which I kind of look at as survival mode, right? It's a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which happens in the workplace a lot. But to be able to identify when we're becoming defensive and don't necessarily have to, right? So for myself and in my recovery, I, as awful as it was early on, I kind of count it as a blessing now, because I've had to be not painfully honest, right? Not airing my dirty laundry at a first interview or something like that, but being open to critique and knowing where my points of weakness are and points of weaknesses are, and learning how to become vulnerable, I think, in the workplace is a really scary thing for a lot of people. And there's different dynamics everywhere, right? Like I'm sure in your job, it's far different than mine, where I work with a bunch of counselors and, we don't shut up about how we're feeling. So, so there's different dynamics, right? So you need a different approach for each, but I think having the starting point that, being vulnerable is difficult. Gaining insight into ourselves is difficult, especially when we don't have some system of feedback, right? That's where the disease of alcoholism and addiction is difficult, because the part of our brain that allows us to gain insight into our actions and how that interacts with our values is just in active addiction turned off pretty much entirely, right? So the 12 steps are aimed at giving us a really simple way of becoming vulnerable with another person. And that's a whole other discussion on how you pick that person and go about doing that. But it's a long way to walk around your question.
Well, one interesting insight is you pick the person. You're not vulnerable with everybody.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's how a lot of us learn to never be vulnerable is maybe early on in life, we don't really have a lot of people to choose from. And that backfires when we're vulnerable, and we just learn that that's not a safe thing to do. And a lot of the people that I work with, myself included, I mean, I had a wonderful childhood compared to a lot of the people I work with. And in reality, I think I did have a good childhood. I had great parents, a lot of fun times, but still somehow I learned that that I needed to internalize a lot of shame about different parts of who I am, right? And by doing that and not talking to other people, I kind of self-alienate, right? I start to think I'm the only one dealing with whatever's presenting in life. Substance use is an obvious thing for my life, but I have a whole other series of podcasts on other ways that I suck in my life as a human that I could talk about. But yeah, being able to pick who you are vulnerable with is something that's really important. And I think that's a reason a lot of people end up going to counselors in the first place, because it does feel safe. You're paying somebody for that confidentiality and that trust. And hopefully in those times you can learn how to do that with other people. But that's difficult. It's a difficult thing to do.
Let me ask you actually about shame, because it seems like shame tends to be kind of a default for a lot of people. And it seems that shame is one of those things that the brain could use to help us self-isolate, or to not help, excuse me, help is the wrong word, but to make us self-isolate. Do you feel like that there's a connection between that actually?
I do. Dylan and I've actually had hours and hours of conversation on this. And, how do we define shame, right? There's a lot of people that have written about it. Brene Brown is one person that's really popular lately, who's written about shame. And, but before I even read any of her stuff, this idea that shame is me looking at an act that I've done or not done or failed to do and saying I'm a bad person because of that. Whereas guilt, at least in my worldview, is, I have done something bad. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm a bad person. So with those barriers around those words, I think one is more productive socially maybe than others are, right? It's good and important for us to have guilt, and we can cause that in each other's lives, right? If we don't hold each other accountable socially, it's not a very fun game to play.
But it sounds to me like you're saying that shame is not something that you share normally with society, and then just helps put you into the downward spiral.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people it does. I mean, I think a lot of things play into how we deal with shame, right? Our spirituality plays a big role into that too. How we look at failure, right? How we define failure, and do we let that define who we are? Is that a learning experience?
How we define sin.
Yeah. And I think some of us are just hardwired to push through deep failures, right? I'm not one of those people. I shut down. I try to hide it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to look at it. And at least in my experience, that's a dangerous way to move forward, because then I bring those scars into other relationships where they don't really belong.
Mm, thank you for that.
Something about like protecting a lie, because I feel like in some way shame is a kind of a lie, or at least like or often lies come from shame. When you feel ashamed of something, you're defensive about it and you're saying, no, I am good enough. Fight me. And like, and you just have to keep layering on the aggressive lies. Is that how either of you see shame and some of the downsides of it?
I'm curious to hear what you think, Laura.
For
Because you work
me,
in HR, right?
I do.
Yeah.
I guess, well, for me, I do love Renee Brown because she discusses emotions in a way that I think a lot of people in the psych world haven't done so far. And I love something about her, by the way, too, which is that she refuses to translate her books. Because shame as an idea, guilt as an idea, are seen in different languages through different lenses as well. So going back to kind of my point, I was raised in a different culture, and shame was seen as something that should not be discussed. So just like you, funny enough, and something that you should always keep to yourself. And yeah, there is the whole pretend of, I must pretend that I am pious, I must pretend that I am good. For the lack of pretending is actually going to exacerbate or is going to show the shape. So
I
there's
find
one.
it interesting because culturally, there are different acts that can fall into the category of shame, right? And different acts socially that fall into the category of guilt, where we kind of work through what does reparations look like, what does rehabilitation or punishment look like.
And what does society think about both?
Yeah. Yeah.
Personally, I see shame as something that I should succumb to, if that makes sense.
What do you mean by that?
That I used shame to beat myself up. So I, instead of resisting the shame and saying, I'm not this person or I'm not that person, I'm like, yep, I am. I suck. Because I suck, I must do the bad things.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's actually what put me into my downward spiral, by just accepting shame. It's just like,
Yeah.
but
As
accepting
truth,
shame
and
in a negative way. It's not accepting shame by saying, well, I am, let's say I am incomplete as a human being, or I am imperfect. It was actually accepting shame in a way that I am a bad person, hence I must do bad things.
Yeah. And that, I mean, at least where I work, we call that, a lot of times we label that as criminal thinking, right? Like we label ourselves as, right? Well, it's true. Yeah. And what we call socially a crime kind of starts that internal feedback loop that just really needs some kind of outward force to stop it. And then to take a step back and look at, well, why does it mean if I use this substance, or if I broke this law, or I did this immoral act, why does that mean that I have to be stuck in this category of an addict or mental health? I think nowadays that there's less stigma, or there's stigma's becoming less. I don't know how to say it. There's less of a force, right? Yeah, stigma's less stigmatized. No, but like talking about mental health has become a lot more acceptable lately, right? And there are all kinds of political parties that are looking at that and saying, well, now we're just reinforcing negative behaviors, right? Because a lot of diagnoses, like the DSM-5, I think would be hard to translate into other cultures too, because a lot of the criteria are, is this a socially acceptable behavior at the end of the day, right? So, but
you heard it here first, folks.
I think we've spoken about this DSM-5 quite.
I don't want to talk
often.
myself out of a job, but it is useful, right? It is useful to be able to give language to these different behavioral, abnormalities or differences, so that we can learn how to live together, right? Learn how to accept each other. And I think, at least in my experience, being given a diagnosis gives me some manageable thing, some tangible something to look at that is outside of myself, right? There's this idea of having a substance use disorder. I have a place to start then, right?
Yep.
it immediately pulls me out of that feedback loop and says, we know what this is, we've seen it before,
We've
and
given
we
it a
know that
name.
there are certain things we can do about it, right?
Right. Okay. Brandon, you are a counselor and you have a lot of experience in helping people make changes to the way they think. This is from an outside perspective, so I might be misstating things. How do you go about helping them rationalize the narratives they tell about themselves with the narratives that they hear from other people, or maybe the expectations they have of other people, and then what you see of them, and maybe what's objectively true about them?
Yeah,
How do you do that?
that's a good question. I haven't fully answered it for myself yet. But I like how you kind of worded it. There's this saying, and I'll probably butcher it, but this is kind of like the reality we all struggle with is I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am, right? Like that kind of inception idea of I have a perception of your perception of me. And the question is, how much is that guiding and altering the way that I'm living my life? And is that doing so in a good or a bad way, right? And I think that's where ideas like shame come into play. But the how, right, of identifying even that you have something you want to change, right? Like there's this idea, and Dylan, you and I have talked about it, this it's called the trans theoretical model, or the stages of change model, right? Have you heard of this, or have we talked about it?
No, but that's a lot of syllables. Awesome.
Yeah, it's way overkill for a really simple idea, right? That we don't wake up one day and think, okay, I'm making this change, and then it happens, and then it's perfect, right? We go through this, but that's how we see
Oh, the
others,
6
right?
stages
A
of
lot of
change.
times. Yeah, so it breaks down changes into these different stages, right? The first one is pre-contemplation, the idea that there may be something wrong in my life, so I'll take addiction, right? Because that's my world, really. There's all these things in my life that aren't going well. Maybe I'm aware that they're not going well, or maybe I'm completely ignorant to the fact that my life is a complete wreck right now. There's zero insight maybe into the problem or the cause of the problem. And that's, leading into the next stage, which is contemplation. That's where we get a lot of denial, right? This idea of, everybody else in my life can see that I'm losing all these jobs and relationships because of my drinking, but I might be attributing that problem to another cause. Maybe
Yes.
I just hang out with a bunch of idiots, or I haven't found the right job yet, or for me, it was health conditions. I thought my life was not going well because I still suffer with chronic daily headaches, but and we all have these different things we blame, right? So the contemplation stage is when we're at least we've identified that there is a problem. We're maybe not entirely sure what the cause is yet, but we're open to learning about it. And this stage can last. I mean, for me, this lasted my 20s, right? Like I really struggled to find to identify a cause that I could actually work on. But so that stage, you're kind of gaining insight into the nature and scope of the problem, and then the planning stage is where you're ready to start taking some steps. You're looking at what should my next steps be. It's not necessarily taking action yet, right? That's the whole. There's 3 frogs on a log. One decides to jump in the water. How many are on the log? There's still 3, because making a decision isn't necessarily doing anything yet. So
Makes sense.
there are a lot of people in AA and NA meetings who are kind of at that planning stage. They've decided something needs to change. They haven't really jumped off the log yet and taken a risk or made themselves vulnerable in taking the steps, or doing an inventory, or asking for a sponsor, going to a counselor, whatever your problem is, right? Again, that's a stage we can stay in for a long time of inaction. And then there's, the action stage. We've identified the problem, what we think the cause is, and what a possible solution is. And that can kind of loop around, right? We try something that we think will work and it doesn't work. And I think that's where a lot of people, at least in my world, when we begin to, we're given maybe say you're in cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy of some kind, and you're given these tools to address the problem, and then it doesn't turn out the way that we thought it would. And that's when a lot of us quit, right? So having that, having support, having somebody in your corner to say that's normal, right? It's normal for our solutions to not work the first time. Here's what we can try next, or here's how we can do that in a different way. So the answer to your question, I think, is, for me, I haven't found a perfect way. Viewing change in that through that lens has helped me quite a bit, right? Because you deal with somebody in pre-contemplation a little different than you would somebody who's in the planning stage, right? Somebody who needs to gain insight about what their problem is, or that there is a problem. You'd maybe want to start building some pros and cons, talking about, what are your life goals? How far are you in achieving whatever that goal is? But building insight, at least in my day-to-day right now, seems to be one of the more difficult things. Motivational interviewing, that's another tool, right? I don't know if, Maha, you've learned about that at all in the HR world, but that's a big buzzword in social work and addictions treatment is
Motivational interviewing. How does that work?
So again, I'm not an expert in it. I've done some training, but there's these different concepts, this idea that you ask more open-ended questions to kind of allow people to explore. You try to identify maybe not what my goals are for the person, right? Like somebody walks in, I could say, well, getting on Suboxone would be great for you. We need to work on that depression. We need to start going to meetings. They're not going to give a shit what I'm telling them to do, right? Until it's our idea, until we've kind of developed our own plan. So motivational interviewing, I think, and again, I may be butchering this, but the goal is more to help the counselor or therapist or HR or manager help guide those people in exploring and discovering those issues for themselves, right? And looking not at what hasn't worked, but maybe what has worked in the past. When has there been a time that life has been going good for you, right? But yeah, getting outside of the yes or no questions is important, but also super difficult.
Man, lots of good ideas right there. I can see half a dozen good applications of that framework to many problems. And maybe that was your intent, but here I am talking about what I like and don't like about a model that I'm sure is like loved by millions, but the pretension, I like that most of the stages are in making the plan. Like recognizing the effort that goes into realizing you have a problem, and then finding out the root cause of the problem, what's actually the problem, and like learning about the problem and exploring the problem.
Giving you the freedom to do that, and knowing that that's a part of the act of changing in itself, right? Like that's the ironic part about those stages is we all go through all of those stages at some point, right? And they're all a step on that road towards building insight or building a plan. And for me anyways, that's really empowered me to spend those hours, spend that time just maybe exploring what's something that's completely off track. I don't think that this line of discussion is really going to go anywhere, but maybe we need to engage in it so that we can, move on, right? That kind of validates that time a little bit. And I do think that is valuable, right? I think in my experience, I've never been directive in counseling and really have a great distaste for people who are because I don't think it's very effective. I haven't seen it be effective. And just as somebody in recovery, that's one thing that I think is of the many that's kind of remarkable about the 12 steps is before these concepts or theories even existed, Bill and Bob, who started Alcoholics Anonymous, a proctologist and stock speculator. The guy didn't even trade stocks. He just speculated on what other people should trade, right? So, but both alcoholics, none of them trained as therapists or counselors came up with these 12 steps that really walk you through those stages of change and help you. And they use open-ended questions. They share their experience, not in a directive way, but as suggestions, right?
Well, it's what's so beautiful about it and what's so funny about it too is that you can just continuously see the same path or the same kind of way of thinking in agile methodologies, in change management, in something like the black belt, in a lot of different things that are actually, funny enough, working. And it's just this realization that there are ways to just continuously explore, continuously experiment, to continuously do something. It doesn't have to just be a one-step solution, i.e., and I'm sorry if I'm going to talk badly about these places, but for example, a lot of recovery institutions, for example, it's
Like
not
a
just a one.
detox clinic
Yeah, it's
where you go in, you're
whereas-
fixed. They
yeah.
they ship you out.
So
Yeah.
one-stop shops are not realistic, and that continuous
No.
improvement is the base of it. Ta-da.
Yeah, there's no cure for being human, right? I haven't met a perfect human yet. I've met some pretty awesome people.
I thought vampires were a cure.
That would be great. Eternally flawed. That would be the name of my book.
Why not? That's awesome.
But yeah, like this idea that there's no cure for a lot of the things that ail us, but there are ways of going into remission, right? And that's at least, and I don't know how applicable this is for what you both do, but with addiction, there is not a cure yet, right? There's no way I'm going to safely drink again or use a drug again, right? It just becomes a bad story. But there are ways of living life a better way, being able to have other people who can help hold me accountable, who can walk with me through my own rabbit trails and possible solutions that don't work. But having the 12 steps are so simple that even me in my inebriated state, I could latch onto it and start, right? And there's a reason that step, like making a fearless moral inventory of ourselves, right, is step 4. If that was the first step, I'd be done, man, right? There's a reason it's number 4, right? Like I needed to, and the first 3 steps are really building insight into, yeah, there's a problem, and my best efforts at fixing it have brought me to sitting in an AA meeting on a Friday night, right? Not that I think that's a bad place, but.
So thank you everybody who listened to us on and who now listen to Brandon as well and share his story. As you know, if you like our podcast, click like, subscribe, and follow us on or listen to us on your favorite channels. And until then, Dylan, see, that wasn't too hard.
It wasn't too hard.
It's never.